everybody. This is Anne-Marie Hunter. I'm the director of Safe Haven's Interfaith Partnership Against Domestic Violence and Elder Abuse. My colleague Shireen Akram-Bashar is here with me today as well. And we're excited to welcome you today to the 6th webinar in our series on supporting faith-based victims and survivors of domestic violence. I wanted to tell you just a word about Safe Havens. We're a multi-religious nonprofit. We're based in Boston. And we train advocates and faith leaders and faith communities locally and nationally to work together to address domestic violence, sexual violence, and elder abuse. In 2003, we became national TA providers for the Department of Justice's Office on Violence Against Women. And we are very grateful for their support in supporting this webinar series. At Safe Havens, we know that not all survivors are faith-affiliated, of course, and for those who are faith-affiliated, faith can be central to their identity, their decision-making, and their healing. We also recognize the tremendous diversity of faith and culture across the United States.
Advocates are called upon to provide services to survivors across many faiths and cultures. To help advocates build capacity to serve survivors from many backgrounds, Safe Havens has put together a series of 8 webinars that look at domestic violence through the lens of various religious and cultural traditions. Today's webinar is the 6th in our series. If you would like to revisit any of the first 5 at any point, they've all been recorded and posted on the Safe Havens website, which is at www.interfaithpartners.org, and we'll continue to post the completed webinars there. So after this webinar, the next webinar is this Thursday, June 1st, and it'll address ways to better support Latino and Latina victims and survivors. And our final webinar will be on June 13th on elder abuse and faith. You'll be able to see the complete webinar schedule at the end of today's presentation.
So today's webinar will explore the questions, concerns, and issues that are particular to understanding and supporting people who are the victims of clergy abuse, which brings with it its own trauma and pain. Our presenter is Reverend Sarah Rieth. Reverend Rieth is an Episcopal priest serving as chaplain at Pennock Village, and it's in North Carolina, and it's a faith-based continuing care retirement community. A diplomat in the American Association of Pastoral Counselors, Sarah has worked with many survivors of childhood abuse and domestic violence, including in the retirement community where she now serves. Sarah works with judicatories to develop policies, procedures, prevention training, healing protocols, and pastoral response teams to address abuse in the church. And Sarah, we are so deeply grateful to you for presenting today, and thank you so much. We're really looking forward to it.
Thank you so much for inviting me to present this webinar. Thank you, everyone, for giving of your time this afternoon to attend this webinar. You see this overview slide, and this lists the content that we're going to cover in this webinar, so please take a moment to review the list. Because this is a relatively short webinar, we cannot address all of these in the depth that they could use, nor address other forms of abuse like financial abuse, spiritual abuse, emotional abuse, bullying, and so forth. But I do hope that the question and answer time at the end will help you to get your concerns addressed. I'm asking that you do as you were invited, which is to type in your questions, but we're going to save the question and answer period for the end. Next slide, please. It is clergy abuse when any person in a faith-based leadership or counseling role engages in sexual contact or sexualized behavior with a congregant, client, employee, student, staff member of any age, adult, teenager, or child, in a professional spiritual relationship. So by faith leader, we mean clergy, religious, meaning say someone in a convent, a nun, or a religious brother, or lay person. All of these can be faith leaders. and it includes, but is not limited to, pastors, rabbis, imams, ministers, organists, choir directors, church school superintendents, youth ministers, on-site counselor or counseling minister, on-site spiritual director, and so forth. Why is it abuse? Because there is a power differential between the faith leader and the congregant. Power is contextual, and we all have various attributes of power, and everyone carries vulnerabilities at all times. A faith leader has the conferred authority of his or her role and the personal attributes of power to serve the needs of the congregant, and that is the faith leader's fiduciary responsibility is always to care for the needs of the congregant as primary and to authenticate the mission of the faith group. So whatever the faith leader's personal vulnerabilities might be at any point, worried about finances or a medical test coming up or the like, he or she has that fiduciary duty and responsibility to use his or her power to serve and not to satisfy his or her own needs for power and control. So suppose that the congregant is the president of the bank and has a lot more power than the faith leader does out in the world. That fact is irrelevant in understanding the power differential within the pastoral relationship, because that bank president in the context of ministry has more vulnerability in that relationship than the faith leader does, because of his or her need for leadership to guide him or her towards meaning in life, towards hope, towards redemption, towards service and mission, towards empowerment, towards connection, towards access to resources of pastoral and spiritual care. The need to trust a faith leader to provide appropriate care makes a congregant even more vulnerable. Of course, children have greater vulnerability than all adults do and have the same needs as above, but children also have the power differentials of age, physical size, intellectual and emotional development, and maturity differential. I want to say right now that it's important as we go forward that we never underestimate the impact of prior abuse in a congregant's life to, quote-unquote, air quotes, normalize abuse now, and air quotes, normalize inappropriate treatment by a faith leader or anyone else. Next slide, please. Please take a moment to look at this slide. Sexual abuse by faith leaders is not any of these things. There might be adultery or an affair, but because of the power differential in the pastoral relationship, that is not it. It's not a momentary lapse of judgment. Abuse is not an oops, it's not an accident, it is predatory behavior. Yes, sexual abuse by a faith leader could happen in the midst of a midlife crisis, but that is not an excuse or a rationale. Yes, sexual addiction might be a diagnosis that is present, but it is not a rationale or an excuse for a faith leader to abuse a congregant. Sexual misconduct is a term that has frequently been used, but I think it is one that minimizes what is abusive treatment. Let's call it what it is. If adultery is part of the dynamic, that label or understanding of the sexual abuse can cloud the issue of abuse, which must be addressed first. And it's never therapy. Next slide, please. Abuse sets up a spiritual crisis, and the dominoes fall in many directions because there is a violation of role and fiduciary responsibility. Someone said, I trusted that the faith leader was going to act in my best interest, even and especially when it's sacrificial to do so. Abuse is a misuse of power and authority, as mentioned previously. It's taking advantage of vulnerability, and it establishes a trauma bond that pairs care and exploitation, love and violence, which leads to confusion about what is love and what is God's love. And it's an absence of meaningful consent. Consent is only meaningful and ethical when there is equal power in the relationship in that particular context, and that is not possible between a faith leader and a congregant. There is not equal power, as I discussed earlier. Consent requires the awareness of potential consequences. Consent requires the internal capacity to say no to unwelcome behavior. And consent requires that saying no will not result in negative consequences for that person, negative consequences such as shaming or cut off from resources, escalation of violence, and so forth. Next slide, please. Grooming behaviors are part of the predatory process, and they're designed to instill trust and a sense of specialness, and to break down the walls or boundaries within the congregant and of any age, as well as a parent or guardian, as well as staff members, as well as the congregation. With children, grooming can take place in such ways as gift-giving, game playing, such as wrestling, to induce opportunity for touch, and so forth. With adults, children, and teens, grooming and manipulation can take place with the use of a seductive voice, seductive behaviors, flirting, air quotes, accidental touch, gift-giving, sex talk, sex jokes, sex texting, pornography. And the grooming is always turning the pastoral relationship upside down so that the congregant's needs, which are ethically primary and are the intent of the pastoral relationship, are subsumed under the now primary needs of the faith leader. For example, a faith leader might get you to care about his or her problems, and then a good caretaking member of a faith community would become interested in offering support and care, and that's part of the grooming process. Secrecy is the facilitator of abuse, and some predators say things like, no one will believe you, or if you tell, there are going to be negative consequences. The new documentary on Netflix called The Keepers has an especially chilling, if you tell, negative consequence to keep secrecy from being broken. Next slide, please. The effects of abuse are many, and they're total, they're holistic, and there's too many of them to go into now, but some of them are anxiety and depression and the physical symptoms that come with that, post-traumatic symptoms such as emotional flooding, numbing, frozenness, isolation, the fracture of primary relationships, and inappropriate boundaries on the part of the congregant, such as behaving in ways that are too trusting, or the inability to trust both other people and God. Next slide, please. Please read this, emphasizing that all crises are spiritual at the core. Thank you. Next slide, please. Abuse is more devastating when it's perpetrated by a trusted leader who's a spiritual authority and a person who represents God, whether that's stated overtly, as some churches and some faith communities do, and some individual faith leaders call themselves representatives of God, but it also is can be unconscious in the part of the congregant member. Some abusers even say such things as, God has given this to us, or God has called us to this. God wants this for you to be whole. God wants you to have love. And so all of this is part of the spiritual crisis, or contribute to the spiritual crisis that comes with the betrayal by the trusted leader. Next slide, please. Please note these 4 spiritual impacts that I'm going to talk about briefly in this webinar. There are many, many more spiritual impacts that are beyond our capacity today. But let's start with, where was God? Next slide, please. Many denominations teach in one form or fashion, many faiths teach in one form or fashion that God is love, that God is always close to the brokenhearted and the vulnerable. That is certainly part of the Judeo-Christian heritage. It's also part of the Muslim faith that love does not take advantage of the needy and the vulnerable, just as in Judaism and Christianity. Many faiths teach that you are unique and precious to God, that God is a loving parent. Now that can be particularly difficult for someone who comes into abuse by a faith leader if a person has experienced prior abuse by a parent or someone serving in a parental role, saying that God is a loving parent, that can confuse the image of God so that, oh, God is untrustworthy just like my parent or just like my step-parent, for example. And it gets confusing. We get to the paradox here because the person is singled out and targeted for abuse. That's one of the things that I think is hard for a lot of people to understand about abuse by faith leaders or any kind of sexual abuse, that the person is targeted for this. And in the midst of that, the experience of the victim survivor is that God was silent, that God didn't intervene to stop the abuse. Why didn't God stop? I prayed for it to stop. Maybe I don't pray well enough. God must not love me. And so the impact on faith can be that the person ultimately feels devalued, that there's something wrong with me, I deserved it. Again, thus love becomes paired with abuse and establishes a template that needs to be reworked in the context of a healing environment, healing therapy, and spiritual care that is healing. Another impact is that, at first I felt I was special. They told me that God, loves me as a unique individual, and I felt special, and the faith leader treated me as special. But now, because of the way the faith leader treated me, now I know I don't matter. Next slide, please. Why did God allow this to happen? Many faiths teach that God is all-powerful, that God is all-knowing, that God is protective. Many people grew up hearing these teachings in the Christian church. In Judaism and Islam, many teachings emphasize that God's power is made known through the ethical behavior and care of the vulnerable by God's people. In the Christian tradition, me too, thank you. Thanks for everybody for hanging in there. So let's start again with this slide. Why did God allow this to happen? The teaching is that God is all-powerful, God is all-knowing. This is true in Christian tradition as well as in Judaism and Islam. We learn that God is protective. These are the teachings that many grew up hearing about. And in Judaism and Islam especially, the teachings emphasize that God's power is made known through the ethical behavior and care of the vulnerable by God's people. One survivor of childhood sexual abuse in her family said that she needed to hear in church about Jesus going after the lost lamb, the good shepherd, who goes and searches for the one who is most lost. The paradox in terms of God's power is, why didn't God use God's power to stop the violence? Why is it that God allowed it to happen? And the impact on faith is that God can't be trusted. God abandoned me. The shame gets implanted in the person that there's something deeply wrong with me, that I am beyond the reach of God. Next slide, please. Is it my fault? We learn growing up in various traditions about sin, and that's the teaching, and that I've sinned and God punishes sin, and that God forgives, but first I must confess my sin. But the paradox is it my sin? So there comes confusion about what is guilt and what is shame. Guilt is, I did something wrong. Shame is there's something wrong with me. So there's confusion about guilt and shame, and confusion about my guilt and my abuser's guilt, my shame and my abuser's shame. Let's remember that because of the power and vulnerability dynamic, it is always the abuser's responsibility and never the fault of the congregant. The experiential beliefs on the part of the survivor is that God must have been punishing me for something I did earlier. I must have done something to cause this. And the impact on faith can be that the fear that I'm never going to be okay, that my sin is unforgivable. A moment, please. One survivor told me that after lengthy healing therapy and having had a caring priest who gave good spiritual care, she said, I learned that because of the abuse that I experienced, I'm not a terrible, terrible sinner as I had been taught, but just an ordinary sinner. And that was redemptive for her. Next slide, please. Do I have to forgive the perpetrator? The teaching, particularly in the Christian tradition, is that we must forgive and that our forgiving others links to God's forgiveness. In the Christian tradition, we're taught that we must forgive 70 times 7. We're taught not to let the sun go down on our wrath and to forgive promptly. In Buddhism, we're not to cling to suffering and to resentment or to anything. In 12-step spirituality, it's to let go and not retain resentments, which is another way of coming to understand a bit about forgiveness. So the paradox is, if I want to have God's forgiveness, I must forgive. That's certainly in the Christian tradition. One survivor of rape by her Christian education director when she was 13 in the church basement was told, when she made report of the abuse, she was told multiple times at the local, regional, and national church level that she has a forgiveness problem. And this woman calls forgiveness the real F word because she felt screwed by the local church and the denomination, that her abuse problem became her forgiveness problem without their holding the rapist accountable. Particularly in the Christian tradition, there can be fear about one's salvation if I don't forgive. There can be a lot of anger that it's unfair that I carry the burden of being called to forgive when this was done to me. And it especially feels unfair and burdensome when to forgive when there's no apology, no remorse, no accountability for the perpetrator. It's important for us as healers and advocates taking the walk of healing from the abuse with a survivor to teach that forgiveness is both a decision and a process, and it takes time. And forgiving and moving towards forgiveness does not let the abuser off the hook with God. It's also important for us to uncouple the phrase forgive and forget. Jesus taught to forgive, and religious traditions teach about forgiveness. Shakespeare said forget. But we are asked to forgive and to move towards that decision and process. Healing involves letting go, but it is not always in one's best interest to forget. So it's kind of the paradox of not clinging in bitterness to what happened and what was done to me, but not to forget either, because not forgetting can be protection against future abuse, can help access, oh, what did I learn from this experience that I need to remember going forward? Next slide, please. I'm going to just ask you to take a peek at this slide and move on to the next one. That survivors of abuse by faith leaders experience the same kinds of impacts as abuse by other people, but the spiritual crisis and estrangement from community may be especially significant and difficult for them in their healing. Abuse can be devastating because spirituality may be one of the things people value most about themselves and their lives. And need during most of their lives and have depended on throughout their lives. The congregation, the Sangha, may be the primary source of support and care in a person's life. In a faith community, people become involved to be part of something bigger than themselves. They get involved for many reasons, including that religion and the faith community are an important part of the person's identity. Joining that faith community is a decision that says something about who the person says he or she is as a person in that faith group. And intense and meaningful connections are made there. It's a deep investment of the self, and so the loss of that community is devastating. Some people are not only spiritually but also emotionally and financially dependent on their faith communities. Next slide, please. Well, I told the story about the woman who was raped in the church basement and what happened to her when she made reports at the local, regional, and national level about the abuse, rape. So that is a telling story about why it's so dangerous to report and frightening to report. We don't know what's going to happen if we make a report. It's essential that church leaders, advocates, and so forth work within the faith community to make policies and procedures and also make them available easily, and not only by request, not only by having to search on the internet and so forth. When I was doing this work in the Diocese of Western New York in the early 90s, we developed policies and procedures and response team protocols and so forth, and we developed a brochure that was in every tract in every church that said this is what the policy is about sexual abuse in the pastoral relationship, sexual harassment, sexual exploitation, and what do you do if you want to make a report or if you want to learn more about how to make a report. These are the numbers that you can call. There were pictures of two people. They're very friendly, warm-hearted people who will work confidentially. So I still think this was a gold standard in making that information available, and not only kind of the church or the denomination protecting itself by getting a policy and procedures in place, but not letting people know how they can access it. Other fears of reporting. Imagine yourself sharing details of a traumatic experience with people that you don't know and whom you have no idea about their trustworthiness. You're trusting that the organization that appointed or called that faith leader in the first place is going to act in your best interest. You're challenging their evaluation of that person. Suppose they don't believe you. Many survivors are disbelieved. Or perhaps they see the intensity of your distress and label you as unstable and therefore not believable. Reporting does hurt others. Of course, that can be part of the trick that an abuser might say, if you tell, then I'm going to lose my job. And so who wants to do that to their pastor or their religious leader? Actually, the faith leader's behavior is what would cause the person to lose the job, not one's reporting, but that's what happens inside the mind after that trick. Many survivors feel responsible for their own victimization and feel responsible for the feelings of those who will be affected by their decision to report. Sometimes the whole family gets shunned. Survivors do lose control over private information. And then there's gossip. Survivors do face backlash from family and friends and community. Some survivors do lose everything in the course of reporting and going through a process of coming to terms and accountability. They can lose money, family, friends, faith community, respect, self-respect, their job, and so forth. So it's dangerous to report. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. But as we move on to the next slide, please. The frequent response is that the institution is going to protect itself and protect its people. So it can reinforce a rigged system of closed ranks by the organization or by the faith leader to protect themselves. The faith leader can use influence and manipulation, say with people in wealth and power in the congregation, to discredit the survivor. They can also play the victim marvelously and not show remorse. All of this is very re-traumatizing to the abuse survivor. So the community's response is crucial in understanding and caring for the survivor of clergy abuse. And it's also crucial in meeting the needs of the abuser and the needs of the community. Often in the past, the response has been one of denial, again with the desire to protect the institution and the faith leader. Again, I refer you to this new documentary on Netflix called The Keepers, which is chilling as far as institutional protection, a systemic protection. Next slide, please. Why do survivors report? With all these pitfalls and potential pitfalls in reporting, and because of the potentially very costly sacrifices inherent in making a report of abuse, why do survivors report abuse by faith leaders? Some survivors report to bring about justice for themselves, accountability for the abuser, support and care for themselves, and to uphold the need for truth within the community. And also to hope that this will not happen to others if the abuser is made to be accountable. Next slide, please. I'm going to amplify this in future slides, but so just take a note of this, please. It's especially important with people struggling overtly with spiritual and theological issues that you want to be able to enlist the help of people who are truly competent, aware of these kinds of situations, aware of what should happen, what's best practices, and can provide depthful, caring, spiritual reflection and guidance. Next slide, please. I want to introduce you to a tool for healing developed by Dr. A.J. Vandenblink called the context wheel. And so depending on your role with a person, you could either do this with the person or teach the person how to do it and then invite the person to do it privately. Using the context wheel is best done in a period of prayerfulness, meditativeness, not as, please check this off your list, another task to accomplish. So how it works is that you identify, the person identifies the core issue of the moment. For example, I stayed in the abusive relationship with the faith leader. Or a person abused as a child or teen might say, after my own father left the family, I thought the pastor was going to be my good father. So the person would write that in the center, where it says issue on the slide. And then the person fills out the spokes of the wheel with all the pieces of context that they can remember that supported and facilitated and reinforced that experience. So the woman who stayed in the relationship with the abusive faith leader. So she would write that in the center, as I said. And then on the spokes of the wheel around, she might write things as, I had young children, I never finished my nursing degree, he believed in me, I was overwhelmed at home, my husband was unavailable to me. All of these going around the spokes of the wheel. He made me feel special and beautiful and loved. I thought I was the only one. I was taught to trust spiritual leaders. My church taught me not to speak up. My church teaches that women are to be silent and passive. Later on, I learned he'd done this to other women. And all of these different aspects of context. Now let's go to the teenage boy who felt deep shame for having been sexually molested by the youth minister. To him, it felt like, I let him abuse me. So he might write those words in the center of the wheel. And then on the spokes he might write pieces of context such as, I was lonely. The youth minister paid attention to me after my father left. I was just beginning to feel the surge of hormones. Sometimes the touch felt good. He tricked me into thinking that my absent father, if he hadn't been a drunk, would have wanted me to learn about sex this way. He threatened me that if I told, no one would believe me, and then where would I be? He threatened me that he would go to prison if I told, and that I would ruin his life. I believed he wanted to help me. Mother was so overwhelmed since Dad left. I was just a kid. Oh, and now as an adult I see that he and not I was responsible for the abuse, and so forth. So the person completes this, and it can be done over a period of days, weeks, months. You can keep coming back, oh, I just have a new piece of context to add to that context wheel. And so, but here's the spiritual healing part of it. The exercise continues with the person prayerfully taking a look at this from the loving eyes of God or Jesus, the loving eyes of the Holy One. How does God look at this? How does God see you? How does the Holy One, what does the Holy One want for you? Jesus was always welcoming people and freeing them from the shackles of their past. The story of the Hebrew people's Exodus shows God's intent for people to live in freedom, not in bondage, and not just slavery, but the enslavement that comes with being, having been abused and trapped in that trauma bond. We can affirm as advocates and clergy and caregivers that whatever our faith community, that the Holy One's property is always to have mercy, always to love, always to understand, forgive, and welcome. And so you want to encourage the person to take all of this in and return to the sheet of the context wheel to see his or her life in a fuller context beyond the shame, beyond the guilt, and to grow in self-respect and integration of what the person had to live through in the context of the Holy One's eyes and heart, and to affirm to the person, you survived, you are resilient, you are loved. Next slide, please. Survivors need to know that it was not your fault, it's not your shame, it is the abuser's shame. You are not guilty for speaking of it. We want to affirm the person's courage for breaking the secrecy that was coerced and breaking the abuser's hold on him or her. We want to know who are the resources to whom the person can confidently be referred for sensitive and quality spiritual and psychological care. We want to affirm, we will help see you through this. You will get through this. You will survive. Life has changed forever, but the God who is love is different from what I learned from the abusive experience. Healers and advocates and congregations need to know not ever to assume the presence of trust by the congregant, even if one is trustworthy. Next slide, please. It's important for advocates and clergy to practice self-reflection. You can see this slide, but I want to amplify it a little bit. So we want to ask ourselves, am I the person or the only person best equipped to help? If I'm not, then I need to refer. Can I go the distance with this person? If not, then I need to refer the person or partner with others who can help us all go the distance with the survivor. It's important to be aware of our biases about other faith traditions, including within our own religion. For example, if the survivor is Orthodox Jew and I'm a Reformed Jew, or I'm a Pentecostal Christian and my advocate is a mainline Christian denomination member. Not to mention then the biases about other faith traditions other than within our own, such as Judaism or Christianity, and their many different forms. Again, not to assume the presence of trust, to practice patience and the deep quality of presence. with the person. Ask the survivor, what does nourish your spirit? What helps you be strong and courageous? What has helped you survive in the past? Some other aspects of self-reflection include curb your own need to know the details. Curiosity can be intrusive. If you're not an investigator in the situation, don't. Keep your boundaries safe and appropriate. Be careful about touch. Reflect on what is the reason for it. What are appropriate limits on it? Is this my need to hug, or is this something else? And how is this going to be experienced by someone who was sexually abused? We never know what's going on unconsciously. It's also important for us to be clear about what is our own countertransference, or another way of saying that is our own set of feelings towards this person, so that we don't engulf or smother the person or reject or abuse the person. And then regarding self-disclosure, for what good reason for this person's best interest am I led to self-disclose? And if I'm going to self-disclose, or I'm leading myself, or I'm thinking I want to, how integrated is this experience or story within me? If it's not fully integrated, worked through, healed, and tucked away, it's not time to self-disclose. And now we have our final slide. The community's response, as I've said, is a crucial aspect for the healing and the justice for a survivor of abuse by a faith leader. Often in the past, the community's response has been one of denial, with the desire to protect the institution. That is not what the survivor needs. That is experienced as another betrayal of trust. So on both an individual and a systemic level, the survivor needs truth-telling and being and experience being heard, being believed, and needs accountability for the abuser. Let me unpack those just a little bit more. Truth-telling. The person needs the opportunity to tell what happened with sensitive and caring people. As I said before, unless you're charged with the authority to investigate, don't. Focus on the narrative truth is more important than the historical details. Curb your curiosity. Truth-telling provides the opportunity for the congregation or faith community to know the real reason the faith leader left the congregation, if he or she did. Opportunity for the faith community to process what it means that the faith leader did this. Without any of this, there is the scapegoating of the victim and his or her family, and there's a kind of psychological splitting within the faith community between the people who believe and those who don't believe it, such that 20 years later there's going to be fractures or sooner, fractures within the faith community over such things as the use of the memorial funds, or giving to a discretionary account, or infighting about other minor matters that fracture along the lines, when you track it back, of who sided up with whom about the abuse, or along the lines of who knew about it and who did not know the secret. We need to shield people who come forward to tell the truth. We need to shield them from further victimization through gossip, name sharing, and so forth. And then being believed. Because of the high cost of telling, plus breaking the silence and breaking the secrecy, it's important to take the victim seriously, even if the behaviors exhibit extreme distress. Faith communities need advocates, because without truth-telling, believing, and accountability for the abuser, healing for the survivor is only in part. It's incomplete. And it's a deeper betrayal of re-traumatization if the faith community is unfaithful to the survivor and justice isn't made. And then finally, accountability for the abuser. Accountability is part of the ethical norm and standard for Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Also part of 12-step spirituality. This is why faith communities must have policies and procedures in place, and leaders who will be faithful to enacting them for the sake of justice and healing for all parties. One final comment I want to make, and that is that Many faith communities confuse forgiveness with accountability. Accountability and forgiveness are two different things. Accountability is ensuring that the abuser experiences meaningful consequences for the abuse and is prohibited from having access to vulnerable persons, including direct victims. The next two slides have wonderful resources for you to access through the FaithTrust Institute website and others. The FaithTrust Institute also has an outstanding instrument called the Community Resource Inventory Map that helps you delineate who the resources are in your local community, from the shelter to the police to good attorneys to advocates and so forth. Mental health resources. This concludes my presentation. I don't know if we have time for questions, but I thank you all for hanging in there through this webinar and for joining us today.
Hi everyone, thanks so much. We do have a couple of questions that came in, and so we may go a couple of minutes over, but the recording will be available at the Safe Havens website, so please feel free to stay if you can, but if you can't, we very much appreciate your time. Sarah, one of the questions we had is, as an advocate, what can we tell a survivor that feels like the need to forgive but do not feel that they want that? How can we communicate to a survivor that it is okay to not forgive?
There's nothing wrong with saying that. You know, timing errors can happen, and it may not be an error we're aware of. You know, suggesting that at the wrong time can really make the survivor feel like you're on the abuser's side. But there's actually some very interesting scriptural study being done about forgiveness and is it actually needed. That information, there's an article about that that's probably 20 years old, that's available through FaithTrust Institute. I don't think that, whatever traditions teach about forgiveness, it's the person's own decision. And we need to let the person take his or her journey at his or her own pace, and not to force our discomfort with their decision not to forgive or not to forgive yet upon them. That's where self-reflection comes into place, that we make sure it's not our agenda, but that we don't get out front of the survivor's headlights.
All right, thank you so much. We have one other question that came in, and we're about to hit time, but please don't feel the need to rush. Do you know of any, or have you ever done any healing rituals with survivors of faith leader abuse? And do you have any ideas of symbolic or ritual practices that can be done with a survivor?
Well, I do know of some. I'm not going to name them because some of them have been poorly thought out. This is, my father once said of one of my brothers raising his daughters, my dad said, he's hand painting those girls, meaning he was just taking exquisite care with them to be present to each one of them according to her own needs. And so I'm loath actually to think it's wise to just come up with a ritual because it could be more for our comfort, to feel like we're doing something. And the most important thing, and if we need to talk with other people about, this is the ritual I'm thinking of offering, what do you think, what are the pitfalls? Because it can help us feel like, oh, I'm competent, I offered a ritual to her or to him, but the most important thing we can do is to be present with the person and take the long challenging journey with love with the person. And I'm not, just so you know, to be clear, I'm not in any way speaking ill of rituals that may be very fine in a given context, but it really needs to be hand-painted with the person. It has to really fit for the person. One example, bad example I saw in literature 25 years ago was that survivors were asked to throw a raw egg into a fire. And, you know, for women who were sexually abused to throw and smash something that is a symbol of femininity and fertility and fragility, and to smash it, that's actually redundant when one has been abused. It's actually violent, even though if it's not violent like I'm going to hurt you violent, but it's not a sound ritual because of using that particular symbol of fragility and femininity when and smashing it when that's already happened. Are there any other questions?
We did. We have one more that came through. Can you offer an example of quote-unquote policy in place to address the abuser, perpetrator, and the survivor?
Yes, I know that FaithTrust Institute has has access to numerous policies and procedures that are denominational. I know that in North Carolina, the Black Mountain Presbyterian Church has its policy and procedures, which at least up to about a year and a half ago, I thought was the gold standard in policies and procedures. That's in the diocese, I'm not in the diocese, in the Presbytery of Western North Carolina. Again, Black Mountain Presbyterian Church and through the FaithTrust Institute, where people can access. And so the wheel does not have to be reinvented if your church, your denomination, your congregation does not have a policy and procedures. The wheel does not have to be reinvented. But for real justice and healing to take place, all of the people involved need healing and accountability so that an abuser would be sent away for an evaluation, a full 360-degree evaluation to see what are we dealing with here diagnostically and what is the potential for restoration to ministry or not by someone who is credentialed to make that kind of evaluation. His or her family need support and pastoral care and accompaniment. The victim and his or her family, or victims and their families, need accompaniment and pastoral care and access to healing resources. And then the congregation, and here's where I see many congregations jumping over this part, is they need an opportunity to have the truth spoken in love, the details that can be made known to be told, and then for there to be time for people to process what that means, how they feel about it, and then going forward, it won't be surprising if this is not the first time that something like that's happened in this congregation. And so how do we get abuse out of our DNA in this church? And how do we go forward with greater authenticity and care for all parties affected by abuse? The congregation, the abuser and his or her family, and the victim or victims and their families. One wonderful question. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. I don't think we have any other questions. Participants can feel free to email them in or fill in any additional questions in the evaluation link, which you will be directed to at the close of today's event. Thank you everyone so much for joining, and I believe we'll close out now.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We truly appreciate your expertise, and we're so glad you were able to join us today. And thank you to FaithTrust as well. And again, they have great resources. Please visit their site. And yes, thank you all so much.